What's up, Ionics, and welcome back to a new tutorial. Today we're talking about handling roles within your Ionic application. Not just about general authentication with a token, that would be too easy. Today we're gonna focus on the scenario like a user has an admin role or a specific user role and is only allowed to access certain pages, or even more detailed, a user has specific permissions for actions that he or she is allowed inside the application, and we're gonna create directives to check directly on elements within our page if the user can see them or can interact with those elements. This month there's also a new course inside the Ionic Academy about building a restaurant manager with an admin role, a service, a kitchen role. So if you're interested in stuff like that, definitely check out the Ionic Academy, my place to help you with everything Ionic. But for today, let's build a cool example of handling roles inside your Ionic Angular applications. Alright, let's start today's adventure with a little setup. We need quite a few files to create kind of dummy application. We're gonna start with a blank Ionic application. We're gonna add 2 pages for the login and for another page that only admin users can see or will be able to navigate to. We need a service that will handle our authentication state. And we need a module for our directives. And we're gonna add 2 directives, one which will check if a user has a certain permission and another one that will check for the role. So both directives will do slightly different things. Finally, we also need a guard, the mechanism to protect our pages. We can already pass implements can activate. We could also use can load, but we will talk about the difference and the problems later for those 2. So this is our setup, which brings us to a nice full app folder. Let's get started with the app routing. We're gonna just remove this. We're gonna make login the very first page, and we're gonna do it like this. Later we will also add our guards, but I think for now we can safely leave it as it is and focus first of all on creating the Auth service. Now, I don't want to put too much time into this, so I will bring in a bit of the code because you're going to have your own authentication service when you have some kind of web service where you get your tokens from, and we're going to mimic all that behavior. We're going to add the storage from Capacitor plugins. With Capacitor 3, this will likely change, but while it's not completely released, we will just use it like Capacitor 2. A little key where we will store some information and an interface for our user. So a user will have a name, a role like admin, user, or perhaps you have some kind of upgrades to a user role, a plus user or something like this, and then certain permissions that a user might have. Perhaps you just have a role, perhaps you backend just have permissions. So this covers or really tries to cover everything that's possible. I usually like to go with a behavior subject for my current user, which makes it quite easy if the user logs in, logs out to just emit the new value on the behavior subject. And therefore, we will also create a function to load the user from Capacitor storage, which we will directly call within our constructor. Now, to load a user, as I said, we will just use some plain data. What we're gonna do is we will call get on Capacitor storage with the key using our token key. Always recommended to not have like my key in here. You will mess up at some point. Just keep it inside a const up there. Now, if we get back a value, we will emit this on our current user object on the behavior subject, and we have to parse it because we can only write strings to Capacitor storage. So we will see after a sign-in how we store it. We will store the object with JSON stringify. That's why we have to call JSON parse at this point. It's kind of important that in the other case we set next to false. We don't set it to null for one reason. Null is the initial value of my behavior subject, and when we later come to the guard or other functionality, we want to filter out the null value, since if your application starts, the behavior subject immediately has the null value, and if your guard or something else is taking that value, you will always get into trouble. So we will always try to filter out that null value and only see, well, if there's data, it's quite easy. But if we have no user and set it to null, it will lead to some confusion. So it's better for the case that we don't have a user or we lock out the user that we set it back to false. All right, that's so far for our load user. Next step is our dummy sign-in. Because I don't have a backend right now, we're gonna make this as easy as possible. I have a sign-in function here. We will check if the name is user. We're gonna set a user object to this, and if the name is admin, to this. Of course, usually you do this on the admin, the backend side. The user has the role user and only one permission to read something, and the admin role admin, and the permissions read and write. Now, at least to keep some sort of flavor that this looks legit, we're gonna use at least an observable here. So let's use return of user object, so we can actually subscribe from the login page and use it kind of like you would do in your real environment. And the only thing we're gonna do after the login, so at this point you would likely make your HTTP call, get login, send the credentials, and get back some user object or just a token. And what we want to do at that point is simply say storage set for our key, which is the token key, the value, and now what I said before, JSON stringify our user. Okay, thanks. That's only one part. We of course also need to inform our current user behavior subject, so we're just gonna call next on it as well, which will set it to it. Can we? We can't, of course we can't. Always the same from Rx. I really need a shortcut for RxJS operators. Anyway, that's where tab is coming from. It's basically just tapping into the result one, not transforming it like map or switch map. Is there actually do anymore? I feel like do and tab is kind of the same, but I don't want to say anything wrong. It might not be completely the same. Let's just use tab. Now, I made the current user behavior subject private for a simple reason. If other pages or services could use the current user object directly like this, it could be a problem because they could emit themselves new values, and you generally want to prevent that behavior. So I made it private, and to get that value, you will have to call the getUser function, which will only give you the observable. Yes, in the past I might have used it differently because you can actually directly subscribe to the behavior subject. But once again, if outside users have access to the behavior subject, it could potentially be a problem if some other page is transforming the values that you don't really want. So we're gonna just return it as an observable. For the logout, we will simply remove all information from storage, set the behavior subject back to false, what I said before, not null, just false, and route back to the login. So let's quickly add the router to our constructor as well, and then the logout should hopefully work as well. Finally, a little helper function, because we're gonna add in the end a directive that checks if a user has a certain permission. And this helper function just checks for a specific array of permissions, going through that, if the current user permissions includes those permissions. If any of the permissions is not inside that array, we're just gonna return false. Otherwise, in the end, we return true, which means the user has all necessary permissions. Okay, great. That's our authentication service and our dummy setup for now. And now we can actually bring up Ionic Serve. Kind of late into the video, but I think we're still fine. 10 minutes, yeah, we're doing fine. All right, for the login, we got really not a lot to do. We will simply inject the authentication service. Why is Visual Studio doing this to me all the time lately? The authentication service and the router. And for the sign in, we're just gonna call the auth function, sign in with our username. Of course, in your case, you would usually pass the username and the password, but at least we got the subscribe block just like before. Now, because I didn't want to make it too challenging, I decided that we will not do any specific routing based on the user role. But if you have like an internal area that users could access and a specific admin area, this could be the place. You could now easily grab the role from the user and then check if the user is admin, navigate to the admin page. If it's a different kind of user, navigate to somewhere else. But we will just do it to home because that should be fine in our case. I just wanted to mention it. It's quite easy to plug it in at this point. Now, for our login page, I came up with really something super challenging, which is a button that either logs us directly in as admin or as user, okay? It's really just an example. I also added a link directly to the inside area so we can quickly test out the guard functionality, because right now we can jump around in our page like we're crazy. Oh, yeah, that's actually what happens if you use quick fun fact. You might have asked yourself why I use replace URL true in these places. Now, see the difference. I open the home page, which is just a router link, and I can easily go back. Now, I use one of those two buttons, which calls this function in the end, and I still can go back. Well, at least the mouse button doesn't work anymore. No, really, usually if you go to this page, you can't simply go back. What did I do wrong? No, did I miss up? I really wanted to show you this, but you usually don't come back to the login at that point. Okay, now let's try to protect our pages with a guard. We can already add in as a login, as a user or admin, and we can access the home page. But we want to make sure that those internal pages are protected, of course. Quick note, first of all, you can remove most of the stuff in here, but second, all the authentication and authorization we implement in this tutorial is not everything. You really need to protect your API, or if you're using Firebase, use Firebase security rules, because at some point users might be able to somehow break into a certain page, and you really need to make sure that all the backend calls are protected, require the certain header for the calls, a JSON web token, whatever it might be. Just make sure that the real security happens on the backend side. Because we right now can't really move within our application, let's, before we dive into the guard, quickly create a logout function in our home page. So we inject the auth service once again. I don't know if you lately enjoyed these videos, but I kind of have a lot of fun doing these. I just wanted to tell you, because today I really feel good about writing some code and talking about it. Thanks for watching if you came to this point. I really enjoyed today's video, and actually the last videos as well. Just wanted to say that random fun fact. Now, once we have injected our authentication service, we got everything red in here. Doesn't matter, it will work in a second. I just wanted to grab the get user. Just show me the result, Visual Studio Code. It's not that big of a deal. So logout, we'll call logout. We know this removes all the token and calls the router to navigate, so we don't need to do anything else. And this will just grab the current user, so we're not confused while testing our funny little roles example. Yeah, that's the wrong button, Simon. Within our application. Once again, as someone pointed out before, it's really important to have the primary color here, otherwise the application totally won't work. And give it a certain title as well. To quickly move out, we're gonna add a button, slot and click event. We'll call our logout function. And I also want to show the current user within a card. Remember, it's an observable, so we're going to use the async pipe, and we also add the JSON pipe simply because, well, the object is an object and we want to log it out correctly. Current user, Tony test, user role, permission read, and if we go in as an admin, we also get that information. That looks great. Now we can finally almost move into the secret page. We at least will add a button that will open the secret page. But what we want to make sure now is that only admin users can enter that page. So right now, basically everyone can do everything in this application. Everyone can move around. We might have to add a little back button to the secret page. I know it's really not super important, but I feel better if we got it. So let's add a second back button with default href to the secret page. And now we can see it. All right, what we need to do now within our guard is, first of all, get the current user. It's an observable, so we need to subscribe to it. We need to filter out the initial null value of the behavior subject. We need to check if the route needs some certain role. So we're just gonna reuse this authentication guard for both role protection and general authentication protection. You could also split this up into two if you want to. And that's basically what we want to do. So within our guard, we add a constructor as well, no problem. Private auth service, we likely need that one to get access to our user. We're gonna inject the router as well. And we inject the alert controller, so we can show a little alert if something goes wrong. We can implement the alert function directly. That's really the most important function we got in here. And then we can move into can activate. Now, do we start at this end or at the other end? I think we start at the app routing. Usually you add a guard like this. You want to protect the home, like the inside area. You add can load or can activate and path in your guard. On top of that, you could also define certain data that you can then access. We used this in the past in another tutorial, I think, as well. What we're gonna add in here is you're gonna need the role admin to access the secret page. So this one will just require you to be logged in. This one requires you also to have the role admin, and we're gonna see how to extract that value in a second. Do we want to make this to the side? Would you like to see that? Perhaps. Oh yeah, actually we use can activate. Now, maybe we can talk about that quickly. I'm usually a fan of using can load. Can load prevents to actually load the whole module file. Can activate only loads the module file and prevents access to that page. In the end, if you inspect or from a user point of view, it's basically the same. From a security point of view, it's slightly different because this or using can load will not even load the sources. Can activate will actually load the sources. But there's another tiny difference. If you have a can load in here, the user goes into the inside area, the page loads at some point, and then you log out. If you then log in again, can load won't trigger again because you already loaded the module file. So if we have a secret page within our application like we do have with that admin page, the admin might log in, go to the secret page, access everything, log out once again. The admin was allowed to load that page. Now another user comes in and can also still access that page. And that is the problem with the can load guard. So therefore we're going to use can activate, which will really every time check if the user is allowed to activate that page. All right, enough of the talk. Let's implement this. What we need first of all is the perhaps expected role for that route, and we can get this from the route data. And because we're not sure that this is set, because for our home area we actually don't have an expected role, we will grab it like this. Let's check it out. If we now go to the home page, we will see our guard can activate expected role undefined because we haven't defined one. If we now open the secret page, we see the expected role is admin. So we're gonna do a little switch with that information. But first of all, we're gonna return this.auth service get user, our user observable, and we're gonna pipe the result. As said before, like 10 minutes before, we're gonna filter out the null values. So we're gonna make sure that value is really unequal to null. Maybe we could use undefined or null in that, but yeah, actually maybe in the future, maybe we're gonna use undefined. We're gonna use take one because otherwise this can activate won't finish. I experienced that in the past, so take it, but give it a try, comment it out and see that your page is not opening. I spent like days on that in the past before. Now we got a user at this point. Hopefully we actually got a user. If we don't have a user, everything really needs to shut off. We're gonna show an alert, and we also gonna return this.router. We actually don't return navigate by URL because if we do it like this, the function will most likely complain that we are not following this super easy to understand dialog. In that case, you could also just return this router parse URL, which creates a URL tree, and that is a legit return value for can activate. So now we have we're returning an observable of a URL tree, and the function is really happy at that point. In the else case, which means we have a user, we need to check if the current user role is equal to the role that we're expecting. So let's grab the current user role and check if we don't have a expected role, which means the data here was null or undefined, or if the expected role is actually equal to the user role, then everything's fine. User can pass, we return true, can activate is allowed. In the else case, meaning we have an expected role and the user does not have that role, we're gonna once again show our little alert and return false. And at some point I used too many brackets or something. Okay, whatever. Yeah, okay, now we're fine. Okay, great, that looks great. Let's see it in action. Okay, duplicate identifier, yeah, we can handle that. So let's try to access the secret page. We see can activate user was actually Tony Test, who is not allowed to access the secret page. If we now go back to the first page and try to go to the home page, we're fine. Since we read that information from storage where Tony Test, we can access that page. Once again, secret page not allowed. Let's try to log out and access the home area. Nope, not allowed. Yeah, we're back here. And now let's log in as the admin and see the path is clear. We're admin and we're allowed to access that page. We could even, yeah, that's of course not the page. Secret. We could now also refresh on that page. Yeah, that works fine. Because remember, within our auth service, we implemented this loading logic in the beginning. So let's add a little login here, set user to this one to make it a bit more obvious. And then, okay, and then we're here inside the guard. So we see that loading user is actually triggered before the guard because we're subscribed to the observable. We filtered out the initial value, but then got the next value, which was our admin, and then everything was matching fine. And once again, if we log out and try to use it as a user, it won't work because the user has not or doesn't have the admin role. Great, so that is protection for the general page or even for a page with a specific role applied through the data in our routing. Now, the next part is that you might want to hide or disable certain elements also based on the user role within your application. And that's where our directives come into play. First of all, we gotta make sure that our directives actually work by setting the exports array to the same as the declarations. Just make sure you export everything that you want to use in another page, and then move to the home module and add the shared directives module. Great, good start. Which permission, the disable or has permission? Let's start with has permission. Let's remove the spec file. I don't want to have this today. Okay, has permission directive. We're gonna pass in a role and check if the user has that, or no, we're gonna pass in the permission a user needs, and then check if that's fine, allowed, whatever. To make this easier, we're gonna go to the home page. Let me quickly bring up another button without any router link. Just a button. Now, usually we apply a directive like this. We take the selector and then we apply it like this. We could then also have different inputs, whatever, role or permission, and then you could pass in that information and could access it in here. Since we only have one input for our has permissions directive, we can make this a bit easier. And we can do it like this. We're gonna name the input exactly like the directive selector itself. We're gonna expect an array of strings like the user needs read and write permission. And then what we can do is simply say star app has permission equals our object as a string. No, I think like this. Like this potentially. That should hopefully, let's give it a try. I'm actually not sure if it's like this. Directive this dot permissions. I'm quite sure that wasn't correct. Directive undefined, yeah. Let me quickly check the syntax. Yeah, the app has permission. Actually, it's right. Read, write. Did I save this page? Am I actually on the home page? Perhaps it's not within the constructor, but within the ng on init. Let's give it a try in here and see if we were able to pass our permissions. Directive read, great. So we now know that for a certain button, we need the read permission. Or let's make it like I did in my example. This was just a quick example of how we can pass it. Let's do it like this. Everyone can see this card when they have the permission read. Only admins or only people with a write permission can actually see this little button down here. So we've actually nested them, and let's see how we can create that. Let's go back to our app has permission directive and change our constructor. What we need is access to a few things. Let me add all missing imports, our authentication service, so we can check between the roles of the user and the input here, and then the template reference and the view container. And you will see how this works together. Now, just like before, authentication service, get user, subscribe. We're actually not super interested in the user object at that point, so we can just use an underscore. But what we're interested in, if this dot authentication service has permission, one of our, or actually all of our permissions. If that's the case, the user should be allowed to see the object or the element. Otherwise, the user should not see the element. Not seeing the element is pretty easy. You just call view container clear, which removes the views in this container, as the function says. Quite easy. In the other case, we're just gonna create the container by using view container create embedded view. We used this in the past, I think before as well. So the HTML template that defines this view, which is actually our very own template reference. That's the only reason we passed it in. It's a template reference. Let's log it out so we can see it. Reference this dot template reference. And with that in place, we should actually already see the first result. Yeah, that is better. Let's see, we are logged in as a user. We only have the read permission, so we can see this card. And this is the directive. The first requires only read. We can see the card. The second one for the button requires write, and we don't get that. The element referent is now the native element, so that's what we either clear or embed within the view. As a difference, so that is the current user, going to the admin, we see the admin actually has this button because the admin has both read and write. And this should now also work quite nice as an array. I actually hope so. Otherwise, yeah, okay. I was really kind of scared for a second that this wouldn't work, but you can now define your own permissions, really have like a huge amount of permissions within your application to either show elements or not show them or disable them. And that's what I wanted to do with the second one. With the second one, I wanted to disable certain elements for a role. Once again, the general syntax for the directive looks basically the same. We will also once again use an input, but this time we are not gonna do it like before, just because, well, that would be too boring, right? What we want to do is we want to disable an element for a specific role. You could also call this enable role directive. Well, I started with disable role and then I just had to go with this. For the constructor, we mostly need not the same. We need only the authentication service is the same. Since we want to change the UI of the elements, that usually means you need the renderer, which can easily set the style of an element like the opacity or any CSS property or attributes. And the element reference is once again the element itself. Now, because we want to change the UI of our elements, we will not use ng on init, but ng after view init. After view init. That's quite important. If you use ng on init, our element will actually be null. Now, once again, authentication service, get user, subscribe, and then we got a user right at this point. We can once again grab the role from the current user, role, there we go, and now we can check. If the, let's call this user role to make it clear. If the user role is equal to the disable for role, so if we said this should really be disabled for regular users, we're gonna use our renderer and we're gonna call set style. And you can now do whatever you want at that point. I would really recommend you play a bit around with this. You pass in the native element, which is the element where this directive is attached to, and then you can change any style. For example, you could change the opacity to, let's say, 0.4. And if you want to make sure that nobody is triggering with this, you could also set pointer events to none. Really important, but could be important if you implement like a website. Now we just need to apply this disable role directive as well, and we're gonna do this to a button within the home page. Now previously we did it like this because the input had the same name. Can we go back? So app has permission, this was the input before. Now we changed it to have a specific name, and we can now access it like this. We just attach the directive to the button or to any element, and then use the input afterwards or before. So the first one will be disabled for users. The second one should be disabled for admins. And now let's check back in the application. We are an admin. We can click this button and we see the opacity for this button changed and the click handler as well. Now, of course, that's perhaps not everything. You could also remove all the buttons if you don't want to have them, but it could make sense in certain situations that you only want to disable stuff. We can still go to the admin area and we can log in as a user, and we see it changed. Now we can only trigger the action for admins, and the button for admins is different opacity and no pointer events. We can still not go to that page. We're able to go from here to the inside area because our information was stored, but now it wouldn't be possible anymore, and our application is mostly secure. We got the guard to protect access to the pages, and we got the 2 directives for more control about certain elements within our pages, because sometimes you don't want to disable the whole page and only just an element, and these directives can help with that. Alright, and that's it for today. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial about handling roles inside your application. It's really actually not too hard. There are different scenarios like routing to specific pages or showing menu elements based on the role, but everything can be really done by having the roles and the permissions inside your authentication service and just accessing that information. You can then spice up everything by applying a guard or using directives for specific view elements to really make your application work in every different scenario, with even fine permissions for every action inside your application. Once again, if you enjoyed this tutorial, also check out my Ionic Academy, the place to learn everything Ionic, and I really hope to see you inside our next video. Have a great day and happy coding, Simon.